Welcome to this session on containment, decapitation, or regime change. We're talking about the U.S. Endgame in Iraq. We have three very distinguished speakers today. Let me do brief introductions. Asha Castleberry is a national security and foreign policy expert, a U.S. Army veteran, and an author of a memoir titled Why National Security Matters. With over a decade of experience in Middle East policy, she served in the Near East Bureau of the Department of State and held key roles in Kuwait, Iraq, and Jordan. Jason Campbell is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where he focuses on international security, geopolitics, and foreign policy. Prior to joining MEI, he was a senior policy researcher at RAND, covering an array of defense and national security issues. From 2016 to 2018, he served as country director for Afghanistan in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Ambassador Patrick Theros is a strategic advisor and senior fellow at the Gulf International Forum. He served as U.S. ambassador to the state of Qatar from 1995 to 98, and previously a deputy coordinator for counterterrorism, where he had the honor of being my boss. He has also served as political advisor to the commander-in-chief of the Central Command. Welcome to all of you, and let me start with Jason, asking what does success look like militarily in Iran? We've hit a lot of things. Where are we in the military process? Have we done it, or are we anywhere near doing it?
Well, thanks, Dan, and thanks to the Gulf International Forum for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here. Look, I would say from a military standpoint, the U.S. has had limited success, I think, in degrading the Iranian military. We hear a good amount of how the Navy has been destroyed, the Air Force is all but destroyed. Yet we have not seen, I think, the amount of internal instability in Iran that I think the administration was hoping this operation would catalyze. And we're getting to a point now, as time goes on, not only are we not seeing the societal upheaval on a scale that was seen back in January of this year, but you're now starting to slowly see a buildup of ill feelings against the U.S. and Israel for the amount of strikes that they've been conducting throughout the country. And I think it's safe to say at this point that, look, the administration, I think, was hoping for a quick win from a military perspective, akin to what was seen last year's 12-day war and more recently in Venezuela. Although I would point out, for the 12-day war, I think the U.S. and Israel were much more focused and disciplined on the types of targets they were going to strike out at and what their strategic objectives were. You saw quickly at the end of that 12-day war, both Israeli and U.S. officials insisting that toppling the regime was not one of their goals. They were simply trying to, as President Trump put it, obliterate the nuclear program, significantly degrade their ballistic missile program, and create a greater gap between the Iranian regime and their regional proxy forces. And I think across those things, they did very well. Part of the problem this time is that we have not had a clear articulation of what the objectives are. If you go back to President Trump's speech on February 28th, or statement about the strikes, he made an appeal to the Iranian people to come back out and take over their government. They have the opportunity. Unfortunately, that didn't come to pass immediately, and soon, weeks later, Trump was back, showing a willingness to negotiate with the current regime, which is clearly sending mixed signals, and not something that was going to bode well for the hopes of regime toppling. Even though we did see them successfully decapitate the regime, we've seen subsequent leaders being targeted to little strategic effect thus far. And it was clear to me that there was no real day after plan for this operation, and that the U.S. And Israel were willing to take the toppling of the regime as a net positive, and be willing to live with the risks of what would come after it, even if it was going to more than likely be a persistent level of instability, if not chaos, within Iran that would then spill out to the rest of the region. And finally, I'll say that the lack of having these strategic objectives clearly articulated and understood, I think, has left the U.S. sort of on its back foot and having to react to events on the ground that haven't been going their way. And I think sometimes when that happens, you have things that go out of sequence or even backwards. So we saw the first 2 weeks of the war didn't go well. So it was then that the administration started reaching out, trying to build a coalition, first with NATO members, and then even out of perceived desperation, China. And I don't know why they would do that, because they're still getting their oil, because Iran is able to continue its oil exports. And we're seeing now, with this buildup of forces in the region, they're not doing this based on a plan. You're looking at, and I'll get into this later, but pulling in forces that are contingency forces at the ready, and staging them in a way that they might be used in a way that might not move the strategic needle. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jason. Asha, Jason suggests that we've had some modest military success, but a lack of alignment with clear political goals. How do you see it?
I agree. I don't think that we've had some success because there's a lack of strategy. And if there is a strategy, it's extremely incoherent. But in terms of the operational efforts, or the line of efforts that I will say has been somewhat successful, is degrading Iran's war making machine, where United States has significantly targeted its missile program, drone program, its the Iranian naval power. So we have seen that significantly, but it's not necessarily achieving those favorable political outcomes, to where the desire of the President of the United States was to find someone that's more pro-American to replace the previous leadership, and he end up with leadership that is more of a hardliner than the previous supreme leader. So a lot of these military activities is not really achieving a favorable political outcome, and it goes beyond just not having a strategy. I think there was a lot of comparisons to Venezuela, where the current administration thought, what we did in Venezuela, we can use bully diplomacy, we can use a level of defense to achieve a specific political outcome without destabilizing the region. And so if you look at Venezuela, it was pretty, there was some instability flared up, but not on the level of what we're seeing with the Middle East. So I think they underestimated Iran to a certain extent of comparing Iran to Venezuela. Now, as far as the military operational outcomes that we're seeing right now, the lack of strategy is definitely apparent, because we did not necessarily really consult with our partners, our allies and partners, prior to going into this. Now, we did speak with Saudi Arabia and Israel, but the traditional approach, like we've seen with Bush did when it came to Iraq, or Obama did as far as Libya, that was not necessarily in place. So now you're seeing a perfect example of this is the United Kingdom. They're right now confused on how to approach in this situation because of the fact that they were not consulted thoroughly by the United States before the preemptive strikes targeting Iran. So if they had built out that coalition and did some sort of consultation like President Bush did with regards to Iraq or Obama, then you would see better military outcomes or operational outcomes or us achieving desirable lines of efforts here. And we're not seeing that right now. So with regards to the recent decision to deploy more troops in place, especially to build some sort of deterrence along the Strait of Hormuz or help work very closely with our Gulf allies. The messaging is all over the place because one minute we hear the administration say we're not sending troops, but then we're seeing developments coming out from multiple open sources. So the messaging, and I know President Trump could be intentional about that, but the messaging is all over the place too, where it's creating some sort of confusion, not just with the American people, but the international community itself.
Thank you very much, Asha. Patrick, Asha sees a lot of political confusion, lack of clear political goals, as well as diplomatic bad preparation, I would say. How do you see it?
I don't want to sound like I'm echoing my colleagues on this platform, but if anything, I think they have understated the degree of American confusion going into this war. One point that hasn't come up very much is that we came into this war in a coordinated, theoretically coordinated method with a fighting ally, Israel. It is very clear that the Israeli endgame, if it exists, we don't have an endgame that has been in any way coordinated with what the Israelis are doing. We seem to have had a tactic at the beginning, rather than a strategy. The tactic was we would do the heavy lifting of taking out the Iranian air defense network and communications and so forth, and then the Israelis would use their superb intelligence to decapitate the government. And they, as they've done in the past, they did a job that was really quite good. I don't know, and I suspect only President Trump himself personally knows exactly where did he expect to be at that end of the first week of the destruction of the air defense network, the steady decapitation of the first tier and the second tier of much of the Iranian government and the Iranian military and security establishment. Where did we expect to be? And that has never quite been communicated to the American public, or for that matter, to the most important recipient of the information is the Iranians. Presumably, the Iranians are supposed to surrender, but there's the old joke of you can't surrender to an airplane. But further than that, the Iranians need to know what it is they are supposed to surrender. Are they supposed to turn the country over to I don't know, like our initial, I find it difficult to describe it other than idiotic, our initial idea in Iraq 2003 that we would turn it over to Ahmed Chalabi, a banker and a fugitive from the law for defrauding the bank, but who managed to worm his way into the American administration, that he could take over after Saddam was overthrown. That one didn't work, and then after that we didn't really have a strategy. This is much worse. I'm at a complete loss as to what constitutes a strategy here. And as I say, the two most important people who should know are, one, our ally, who should be on the same wavelength as we are, should be with the same script, and as the senior partner, we should have written that script. There's no evidence that was ever done, and even more importantly, what are the Iranian supposed to do? We can sort of work our way through, and we also, for some reason, seem to believe that the Iranians would never trigger their asymmetrical nuclear weapon, which is one, closing the Straits of Hormuz, and secondly, making it clear that their earlier threats to take out the oil and gas export infrastructure on the other side of the Gulf were real, and they've done that. They've done it particularly in the UAE. I'm not quite sure why the UAE has gotten the brunt of the Iranian response, but they've taken out 20% of the Qatar's capacity to export gas and other byproducts. That's if and when the Qataris are able to start up again. It's even if tomorrow there was a complete Iranian surrender, it'll take the Qataris at least a month to 6 weeks to start it up again. And similar things have happened in Bahrain and in Saudi Arabia. So,
Patrick, let me stop you there because it's quite clear from our three speakers so far that there were poor preparations, that coordination, clear political objectives were not available, and it's still not available to us. But we are where we are. And we are in a place where the Iranian military capabilities have been, I would say, seriously degraded so far as we can tell. The Gulf allies are under attack. The Israelis seem to be prepared to continue this for as long as we'll be prepared to continue it. So the question becomes, what would you tell the President of the United States today that he should do, given where we are? Let me start with you, Jason.
there are
Thanks, Dan.
Jason, yeah.
Jason,
Great.
yes.
So look, yeah, that's a great question, and it's one we've all been pondering here for a little while. Look, I think fundamentally, I think the administration needs to start understanding that the way out of this is ultimately going to be political and not military. And again, I go back to my reactionary question. They're doing things in a somewhat of a haphazard sequence where now this next escalation that's being considered, at least, is to use two Marine Expeditionary Units and the immediate response brigade with the 82nd Airborne in some attempt to use them to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which, for a number of reasons I'm happy to get into later, is a very long shot at best, and would bring a tremendous risk against those forces. We're also seeing now other countries impacted by the closure of the strait, on a more of a bilateral basis, reach out to the Iranian regime and try to make some sort of an arrangement to get their boats that have been trapped now in the Persian Gulf for a number of weeks safe passage through the strait, at least to get the boats out. I don't know, the extent to which this is going to, be a new normal in terms of Iran serving as the effective gatekeeper to the strait. But while the U.S. seems to be still stuck in playing out military-centric scenarios, other countries, I think, have recognized that, at least in the immediate to near term, some sort of a political accommodation is going to have to be made. We saw this last weekend where Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent went on the Sunday shows and floated this idea of releasing some of the Iranian oil that had been confiscated on the seas, and for at least a trial period, removing the sanctions on Iran. And we haven't heard a lot of follow-up to that, other than some of the criticisms of that would, the amount of funding and other money that would give to them, and how the mechanics of that would work. But to me, watch that with some interest, because it seemed to me the administration is at least starting to understand that it's going to have to make probably some concessions in terms of what it would be willing to sign off on among Iran's demands, and will, I think, definitely have to accept less of the maximalist approach it has stuck to when it comes to the nuclear program, the ballistic missile program, the proxy issue. I think they are going to have to start thinking more modestly along those lines and find a way to communicate ideas to the Iranians through some intermediary.
Jason suggests that the movement of 7,000 ground troops, apparently to do something about the Strait of Hormuz, is a pointless enterprise. The administration did submit to the Iranians a proposed political solution, that the Iranians this morning rejected. It apparently contained all of the old American demands, getting rid of the nuclear program, limiting the missile program, limiting assistance to the parastatal proxies in various other countries. So we are where we are. The Americans claimed, President Trump claimed yesterday or the day before, that the Iranians had given him something of enormous financial value. We don't know what that is, or maybe you do know what that is. The American proposal, diplomatic proposal, has been rejected. What do we do now?
Well, one starting point as far as going back to the deployment of the 2,500 Marines or the 82nd Airborne, I think that could be a starting point as far as considering not deploying those troops to the Strait of Hormuz for two reasons. One is that I think that may move the needle for Iran to come to the table to speak to the United States, and because just based on lots of sources, Iran, as long as Iran continues to see American military buildup, the less likely they will come to the table. So that may be something that they need to take into account as far as negotiations. Although we've seen with President Trump, he likes to use the hammer while being in pursuit of peace negotiations. Another concern in terms of deploying troops or more troops to the Strait of Hormuz is that I think the United States is failing to realize the operational advantages that Iran has over the United States with regards to the Strait of Hormuz. It puts us at a significant vulnerability to Iranian threats, to Iranian military attacks. They know that terrain really well. They know how to outmaneuver us in that aspect, and us, especially in a unilateral fashion, it's going to be very hard for us to be able to fight back, and we definitely will have to need a coalition in doing so. So that's a key point. Now, going back to the diplomatic approach to it, there is a 15-point plan that's out there, and it was just reported that Pakistan is in the lead. I would say to the President of the United States that while this 15-point plan is happening, I think you need to consider de-escalation in terms of not being in pursuit of a military buildup. And then also, too, while you're continuously being very provocative in this region, you might want to get Saudi and Israel on the boat in terms of making sure that there's an alignment politically. And then simultaneously, you have to think about your homeland as well. Your homeland is now more vulnerable to more foreign threats right now in terms of we saw just recently a flare up of internal attacks for different reasons, whether it was in Michigan. And I just lost a friend who I served, a lieutenant colonel down in Virginia, who was killed in an ROTC program. And then we saw something flare up, a Texas shooting not too long ago, right after the preemptive strikes. So you have to also ensure that the Department of Homeland Security is in place in terms of protecting the homeland from cyber threats conducted by Iran. Iran is really good at this. They have a history of successfully being in pursuit of cyber attacks. So while this is happening, being in pursuit of diplomacy, de-escalating military buildup, but also making sure you have hardening your defenses as far as protecting the homeland.
So Asha has offered us a number of very clear options for the president right now: protect the homeland, de-escalate in the region, continue the diplomatic effort, even if the 15-point plan seems to have been rejected already. What do you say, Patrick? You're a diplomat.
Yeah.
Where do you take this?
It's a tough call, but I would, before we do any of these very reasonable proposals that Asha and Jason have talked about, before we do any of this, we have to make sure that we are in control of our side. If we call, say, a 2-day ceasefire as a message, we have to be 100% certain that the Israelis will do the same thing. We have to get the Israelis to understand that we have the biggest risks, and we have taken and we are the biggest player in this confrontation. So Israel has benefited. So in my view, our first requirement is to make sure that the Israelis are reading from the same scripts, or the same sheet of music. A couple of days ago, I think it was, that Netanyahu, and I don't know if he did this publicly, I forget right now, Netanyahu basically told the Israeli military that they have to proceed and up their game, because he wanted to make sure that he took out the Iranian armed forces and all their capacity before the Americans started a diplomatic process going, or before the Americans did something. And the second part of what Trump has to do is he has to get some political support back in the United States, which means he has to get the Congress, the Senate in particular, but the Congress and the Senate, to give them really good briefings and tell them what it is that he believes can be accomplished now. It could be a spectrum. It could be from, we're going to land the whole of the 82nd and 4 or 5 Marine amphibious groups from one end of the spectrum to try and hold the Straits of Hormuz, to the other end of the spectrum, which is declare victory. We've already done so much damage, and unilaterally say the war is over. But he can't do that convincingly until he has political support from the United States. He is, obviously worried about the midterm elections, but he's got to risk it. He rolled the dice. It didn't work out so well. He's playing catch up, and getting the Israelis on board, making it clear that the Israelis will follow our lead, and will either that or we'll leave the Israelis and go home. And the other part of the game is he has to shore up political support in the United States so it looks convincing to the Iranians. And he has to go and say to the Senate, I'm going to do this to get out of this, to end the American engagement. I expect that you will help me by allowing me to waive sanctions, the ones that I can't waive by myself. But in the end, he has to prepare the ground on his side before he can even approach the Iranians. And the Iranians, I think, will not react until they see that there is, in effect, a unified American, Israeli, and domestic American political team, all following the lead of the United States.
Color me spectacle, Patrick, and I'll turn to Jason for his views. Color me skeptical. Why? Because I don't think the Israelis show any sign of being prepared to restrain themselves. And so far as American domestic political support is concerned, I can't imagine changing the current situation which has about 1/3 of Americans supporting him and supporting the war. And frankly, even if he called a ceasefire that the Israelis were willing to cooperate with, I have no reason to believe that the Iranians would stop. Why would they stop under those circumstances? They would just continue to rain hell on Israel and the Gulf allies. But Jason, do whatever you like, but
Right.
I'll be more hopeful if you relieve my skepticism.
No, look, I'm skeptical as well. And part of that is built on just look at what's transpired over the last year. On 2 occasions now, the Iranians have been attacked while engaged in talks with the U.S. By the U.S. and Israel. And I think, from the perspective of Iran, the regime looks at this as an existential threat, an existential issue. And it certainly does not want to pave the way to be reattacked in 9 months or a year by accepting a ceasefire, based on current conditions and just going back to whatever the status quo was prior to this war. I think you're absolutely right that they want to continue to extract costs on the U.S. and Israel and do everything they can to ensure that they will never again be subjected to this type of, from their perspective, aggression. I think that they are going to continue to wield influence over the Strait of Hormuz, and how that plays out in the coming weeks and months. Again, it might be just as some sort of a gatekeeper where they insist on ships from various countries paying tolls or not based on their relations with them. They want to be released of sanctions, of course. And right now they are in a position where they appear to have the upper hand. And the U.S., and this is something I wrote the day after this war started, was that the U.S. was setting in motion a series of events it could no longer control. And I think that's what we're seeing now. And I do agree with you that Israel has a much different strategic perspective on the region than the U.S. I think it feels it is far enough physically removed from any sort of chaotic situation that may arise in the toppling of the regime that they were willing to live with the aftermath, particularly given what the continuation of the regime might mean for their security. While the U.S. obviously has its own very important interests in the much nearer abroad from Iran and the Gulf, certainly has closer ties and relations with the GCC states and other Arab partners in the region, and I think came into this with more to lose, which makes it all the more confounding. What these false assumptions were going in, that this was going to be some sort of a quick contingency or a little excursion, as we were told a couple of weeks ago. Again, at some point, I think this Trump administration is going to have to make some political concessions. It would prefer not to, but really doesn't have much by way of options, and will have to, as you, Dan, and the other speakers so rightly point out, will have to bring Israel along in some capacity to get to a point where the various sides are willing to, if not, again, go back to whatever the status quo was, have a cessation of hostilities and some sort of a firmer a schedule and agenda for ongoing discussions.
Thank you, Jason. Asha, it seems to me that we succeeded, or the Israelis succeeded, at decapitation. Regime change doesn't seem to be on the horizon. You never know, of course, but the president doesn't even seem to understand what regime change means. He talks about it as replacing the supreme leader, which is not, of course, regime change in any reasonable definition of the term. But there is this other option in the title of this program, containment. Can you help us understand what containment might look like? Do you think it's even vaguely possible? And do you think containment could include some kind of reversal of the Iranian control over the Strait?
Yes, thank you for the question. Well, I can answer that in so many different ways, but in terms of what containment looks like is in order to achieve containment, which is to ensure that you're fully effectively addressing potential Iranian aggression that's a threat to regional and international peace and security. We were in the business of doing that, but in order to authentically be able to achieve a containment, you have to work with your allies and partners. And just like you use the word, you're skeptical, I'm skeptical too, because what we've seen since the beginning of this administration, we have used bully diplomacy or have been in pursuit of not really effectively working with our allies and partners. So, I served as for instance, the Kuwait desk officer, and that was my big responsibility to ensure that we build out our coalition, we work very closely with our regional allies and partners as a way to counter Iranian aggression. But if we have been beating up that concept, it's hard to enforce it or implement it moving forward if your credibility has been shot, especially if you have ill prepared your allies and partners to be proactive or reactive when it comes to addressing aggression. So, so do I think it's possible? I think it is, but it's harder to achieve now, especially with not only you have with regards to not really effectively working with your allies and partners, or more specifically our regional allies and partners, the Gulf states and others, but also with regards to a new type of leadership that that you have explained significantly in terms of, is this a favorable regime change? Did we achieve regime change? It looks just like Venezuela, and the answer is no, we have not. In fact, we created something that is more unfavorable than we had previously. So it will be harder to achieve.
Thank you, Patrick. You're the diplomat. Is it possible to contain Iran, and how would you get there from here? And how would you, what shall I say, try to get back to the status quo ante on the Strait?
I don't honestly understand what containment would consist of. Does containment mean that we prevent Iran from launching military attacks on the neighborhood? That's probably fairly easy. The Iranians have no real interest in beating up the other side. The only reason they're doing it is because they see it as a way to get us to back down. That and the seizing of the Strait of Hormuz is not, in a course of a ceasefire, is not in Iran's interest. But the Iranians now probably feel a certain sense of, we've got the Americans on their back foot. We're going to make some demands. And I'm a little worried that the more the Iranians make their demands, the more difficult it is to back down from those demands for the Iranians, say for reparations. They've got to show their public that that their sacrifice was not in vain, that how many thousands of Iranians have been killed or maimed, that there's going to be something that makes them whole, and not makes them whole, but somebody's got to pay for it, and either the regime's going to have to pay for it. I think personally, I am in the let's declare victory and go home right now mood, in hopes, and I think not an unreasonable hope, that it plays out a little bit something you worked on, Daniel, which was Milosevic in Serbia. We could not unseat him with an air attack, but as soon as it was over and the Serbian people saw the mess that they were in, if I remember correctly, Milosevic didn't last a year thereafter. I think there's a great deal to be said for just pulling out, telling the Israelis that we want them to stop and that we will cut off the flow. We will pull out the FAD that's in Lid and pull out any other assets. Take a couple of the anti-aircraft ships off their coast and say, you've got to stop too. And then, in effect, say to the Iranians, so long, guys, sorry about that. And now you've got to stew in the mess that you helped create because you had a regime that was making it impossible for Iran to cope with 20 different problems that we had nothing to do with. I think the best way we can achieve regime change is to pull out, declare victory, use it in a way that doesn't do too much damage. He's going to have to figure out that it doesn't do too much damage to the administration in the midterms. I'll leave that to people who are better at that than I am. But I don't believe that there is a reasonable prospect of any success that would be better, that would have better results for the United States than declaring victory and going home.
Well, that offers us a very clear alternative, and I think Asha is more or less along the same lines. I'm a little bit less clear about you, Jason. Do you see an escalation option that is viable and worthy of consideration, or would you also say let's declare victory and go home?
Yeah, look, there is no viable military option right now that or other people I engage with on a regular basis would endorse. Again, and I'll maybe touch on this a little bit more detail now with this, the deployment of one of the Marine Expeditionary units from Okinawa to the region. We've got another Marine Expeditionary unit we call the MEU. Recently left San Diego, heading to the region. There are now reports of, again, the immediate readiness brigade with the 82nd Airborne maybe or is planning to be sent to the region. And my sincere hope is that this is all just messaging or trying to change the Iranian decision calculus ahead of some more intensive talks on what might end these hostilities, because ultimately I think the administration, as I said earlier, is going to have to make some political concessions it would prefer not to. I don't see how, roughly speaking, with these units, you've got just maybe 7,000, 7,500 forces that could indeed be injected onto Karg Island or any one of a smattering of other small islands in the Strait of Hormuz, but they would be under very heavy fire from an assortment of projectiles from Iran. They would be under great duress for the time they were there. The U.S. other assets that are currently striking out at various targets within Iran would have to be repurposed to, I think, provide additional cover to these units. They would absolutely absorb heightened casualties. And you're seeing even now reports of Iran seeing that this might be in the making. Are already preparing, traps and other mines and other things around these islands in case that comes to pass. And quite frankly, that even if the U.S. was able to take one of these islands using contingency forces, so there would be no backup plan, because these are the forces that you would call in to respond to a crisis if one were to happen. I don't know that really moves the needle from the Iranian perspective. There's this narrative that, well, Karg is the main oil export location for the Iranians, and that's true. But if you remember, just back to the maximum pressure campaign of Trump's first administration, Iran was getting by well enough exporting 90% less oil than it is today. So sure, you could deprive them of their oil exports, but they've already demonstrated that they can withstand that punishment for a while. And I don't know that Trump has the time to keep, again, very vulnerable, exposed forces in that kind of a position while waiting for the Iran economy to collapse.
Thank you, Jason. We've got a couple of audience questions I'd like to turn to. The first of them, I think I'll answer myself. What is President Trump ultimately trying to do? Well, we don't know. I mean, fundamentally. But it seems to me the drift of our discussion so far is that the only real possibility here in the near term is a narrow deal rather than a broader deal that alters the Iranian regime and its role in the world. We have a question about Russian support to Iran and whether it could alter U.S. military planning and shift, presumably in favor of Iran, the balance of power, military power. Asha, do you want to take that one on?
Yes, thank you for the question. It definitely takes into the National Security Council has to take that into account in terms of Russian intervention, Russian planning with Iran, and even with China too. We have to take that into account. In fact, Iran and China actually had established a 25-year relationship that was mixing with defense and diplomacy and other soft power initiatives as far as working together for the next 25 years. We have to take that into account. But it all depends on what the President of the United States drug deal is with Russia. What exactly is he taking into account in terms of is it okay to provide grid coordinates of where U.S. troops are located and still be able to lift sanctions on their oil and gas supply? If that's the case, then that definitely puts in a twist when it comes to the overall Operation Epic Fury. So it is very important to know, but in U.S. strategic interest, what it should be is that Russia should not do that, and we should be fully addressing Russia's intervention involved in this. And if so, if it does fail in terms of Russia still being able to help or support Iran, then we should definitely look not only directly address Russia, we should definitely partner up more with Ukraine as far as counter Russia more as well.
Thank you, Asha. And we have a question about, President Trump has suggested that the Europeans should come in and somehow take the strait back. That's clearly not going to happen. But there's a question about whether European and Asian countries might somehow contribute to a kind of naval peacekeeping force if there were an agreement to reopen Hormuz. Can we picture something like that happening after this war is over?
I believe we could. Clearly for the Europeans who, are in the midst of their major rearmament program and are really stretched to the limit in terms of supporting Ukraine and so forth, they would have to be fairly certain that this is that they're enforcing a naval regime that the Iranians have bought into. We can't just unilaterally declare that we're leaving and we want that the Europeans will come in behind us to do what? Escorting ships? I would not like to be any European Minister of Defense who has to explain to his own public why his brand new $800 million frigate just ran into a mine. There's got to be a lot of work done. Frankly, if I can sort of lean back I think the best thing we could do would be to let the Iranian regime on its own explain to its own people why they're in such a mess. The other thing is I entered the Foreign Service just before we went into Vietnam. And I watched that whole escalation. I was in the operations center for part of the Vietnam War. I still have a nightmare reminder that at 3:30 in the morning, the President of the United States called the junior officer, me, and wanted to know what some senator had said if it was coming off. And my first thought, besides not believing it was the president, from which my boss saved me, but my first thought is, what is the president of the United States doing up at 3 o'clock in the morning, asking this junior officer in the operations center what's going on? I have this fear built into me that any step forward is just going to get us into a situation where it's a little bit more. Let's call up a National Guard unit. Uh, let's do this. I think we're going to find the Gulf states distancing themselves from us. They really can't contribute that much more. Their militaries are not designed to do amphibious operations in the Strait of Hormuz, nor are their ships. Do they have a navies that can even do much more than show up next to our ships? And the Chinese and the Russians are going to be eating this up. I worry about if there is no plan, that involves an early American departure. The only other plan is making it bigger and bigger and bigger in hopes that at some point the Iranians will break. So the question is, to me, at the two extremes, do we pull out, declare victory and pull out, or does this become Syracuse? Is Trump playing Alcibiades at the Peloponnesian Wars, where
So
he's just,
this is a question of the sunk cost fallacy.
yeah.
Always trying to do whatever little more you think will turn the trick. But is there anything that would, the United States hasn't used all of its non-nuclear military power in this effort yet. We haven't even come close. I mean, I forget the exact number of U.S. troops deployed for Desert Storm, but it was in the hundreds of thousands, not 7,000. Is there anything that would tip us in the direction of a truly more aggressive effort that would that would reasonably tip us in that direction?
I
Yeah,
think.
and I'm happy to. Sorry,
So-
go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah, ask Joseph Tito in the grave.
Jason,
He ran an insurrection in which half the country was against him, and he was outnumbered, surrounded, outgunned. Anything you can say. I once talked to a German general who said that the only campaign we really truly lost was Yugoslavia. We got without excuses. We got excuses for the Eastern Front. We've got excuses for the Western Front. We've got no excuse for Yugoslavia.
Jason,
Yeah, look, in an extreme scenario, what you're talking about is a comprehensive invasion of Iran as like the very far end of the spectrum, which, as you I think correctly put it, would take hundreds of thousands of forces. You have to remember, Iran is 4 times the size of Iraq with double the population. It is a topographical nightmare of mountains and hills and other things, especially surrounding Tehran, which itself has a population of 9 million in the city and a 12 million population of 12 million in its immediate environment. So you're talking about something that you would plan for months and years, if not a year. You would mobilize the forces, you would stage the forces somewhere, you would have to come. I mean, it is such a monumental undertaking, and again comes with so much uncertainty in terms of what you're going to be able to accomplish, and what then, even if you do accomplish it, what does the day after planning look like? Prior to that first Gulf War, yes, we went in with hundreds of thousands of forces. We had them staged in Saudi Arabia, but we also had a very vast coalition of willing and informed and invested partners. In Iraq, we had some multinational partners join us for the 2003 invasion, and we were able again to stage in a neighboring country, friendly country, with ground forces that could literally just drive into the war, and again with not enough forces, as we painfully learned after a few years. There, the factors that are set up for that kind of an option in Iran are just simply not there, particularly at this stage. And Dan, I would point out too, yes, the U.S. has a lot of military assets that at its disposal, but we've already seen with some of these higher end assets, the ATACMS missiles, the precision strike missiles,
Great.
the Army, we've already blown through 45% of them, and at the rate we're firing them at, they won't last through April. THAAD interceptors, which are our highest end air defenses, have already been 40% attrited, and again, fired at the rate they're at now, will not last the month of April. So yes, we have assets, but some key assets we've already tried, and again, we're already pulling at our readiness levels from other parts of the world. Washington Post just today says the U.S. is considering moving some of its military aid from Ukraine to move it to the Middle East. We've already moved a MEU from Okinawa. The Marine Expeditionary Unit is now on its way to the Arabian Sea. We had the Carrier Strike Group, the Abraham Lincoln, moved from East Asia to this region. So we are taking on a lot of risk elsewhere in the world, even just to get to where we are right now, which isn't great.
I thank you for pointing that out, Jason. The opportunity costs here are gigantic, quite apart from the $1 billion a day. Yep. It's incumbent on me to try to wrap us up. I think unusually in panels of this sort, we see a pretty strong consensus in favor of what Patrick has called declare victory and go home, or at least de-escalate, hoping that will lead in a good direction. I did want to return to the question of Serbia, because Patrick's quite right. It was a little bit more than a year before Milosevic fell after the war with NATO. But I think if there's any prospect of regime change, it's after this war, not before. This regime does not have a lot of popular support, and but during wartime, there's just no hope for regime change, and there is some after the war. So let's end on that somewhat more hopeful note. I thank you all. Thank you, Asha. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Jason.
Daniel.
And thanks to the audience as well for joining us today.